Well, good morning and welcome to another week of Journey with Christ. My name is Mark Mitchell. I'm the host for our show today, and I'm the preaching minister for the Park Avenue Church of Christ in Charleston, West Virginia. I am joined as usual by Steve Fox, who's been a minister for over 50 years, believe it or not. What's going on today, buddy?
I fooled that many people, didn't I?
Yes, you did.
Wow.
For that long. What an accomplishment.
You know, I don't mean to be really cynical, and I try as I live my life to not be real pessimistic. But West Virginia's had a bad weekend.
Yes.
We had little 13-year-old girls killed on the interstate. We had a home that caught fire in Greenbrier County, killed 5 people. And then yesterday morning, a teenager at Elkview shot and killed 4 of his family members.
Yes.
And when you start reading about stuff like that and thinking about stuff like that and say, you know, in some cases that's just evil. That's all that is, just evil. And what are we going to, well, man doesn't have the power to have any control over that. You just try to do the best you can to go through. And this book that we've been studying talks about the suffering that these Christians are going to have to go through in the first century. Mm-hmm. And I'm sure they were sitting there thinking, why do we have to go through this?
Why does this even happen? Mm-hmm. I mean, the book of Psalms, or Psalm, how many times does the various writers put in there, "Oh Lord, how long?"
One of the words I remember from college is imprecatory. David wrote some imprecatory psalms where it doesn't sound like that's what he really wants to say, you know, like killing other people and killing the enemy and bashing babies' heads up against a mountain so they could get back at their enemies. There's some imprecatory psalms. There's your word for the week.
Oh, okay. Yeah, and you're right. The situation this past weekend, from the fires, from the horrific idea of that kind of crime scene, but more overwhelming is the idea that a sibling would do that to their entire family.
Yeah.
So
he's 16.
Yeah. It gives us pause considering the world that we live in today. And you bringing it in context with the book of Revelation, which describes some things that make no sense to us. And I'm sure there were people that read it back then, when they read it, were thinking to themselves, okay, now what's going on? You know?
Well, one of the great messages of this book is it's not always going to be like that.
No.
Well, and that's why I can't wait to get to 20, 21, and 22, because those 3 chapters are so...
2021, it's only about 16 more days.
You're exactly right. We're going to have to jump over a couple other chapters, aren't we, if we want to get to it. Now...
I couldn't help myself.
I know. Now see what I feel when I can't help myself? Yeah, that's pretty bad when you're defending yourself by saying, hey, that's what Steve would do.
That's what Steve would do.
I couldn't help myself. But that entire message, and there's a bunch of messages, individual messages in this book, but one of the great messages is just hang on, just hold on a little bit longer, and you're going to be okay.
That is...
and that's hard for most of us to accept.
It really is. I mean, we want no pain, no suffering, no inconvenience, no hard times. We want everything to be laid out like it's the perfect world. And God has told us, well, we kind of blew that back in Adam and Eve's time, and this is what we're stuck with.
Yeah.
I mean, you create the world we live in, and I know people don't like to hear this, and I understand that, but we have created the world that we live in. We've built it stick by stick, stone by stone.
Kind of like sleeping in the bed that you made, right?
Yeah, sleeping in the bed you made. That's right.
Well, Revelation is such a fantastic book because of the fact that it does have those messages. And if we can just hold on, nobody wants to do that. Nobody wants to say, well, boy, when I get up this morning, I want to have a bunch of tribulation in front of me so I can be like Christ. Nobody in their right mind wants to do that. But when it is there, and you do face it in the mirror head on, maybe one of these days, that's his promise, it's going to be better. It's going to get better, and then there's going to be a time when everything is 100% better.
Oh.
Yeah, and that's
that I am looking forward to.
That's when we get to new heavens and new earth.
Yeah.
Please bring it on. Bring it on.
Maranatha. Maranatha. Well, we're going to be today in Revelations chapter 10, and I'll begin reading in verse 1 of chapter 10. Then I saw another mighty angel coming down from heaven. He was robed in a cloud with a rainbow above his head. His face was like the sun, and his legs were like fiery pillars. He was holding a little scroll which lay open in his hand. He planted his right foot on the sea and his left foot on the land. And he gave a loud shout like the roar of a lion. When he shouted, the voices of the seven thunders spoke. And when the seven thunders spoke, I was about to write, but I heard a voice from heaven say, seal up what the seven thunders have said, and do not write it down. Now, I found another picture. And this one was hard to come by because this was many different ones. Of course, we've got our Revelation 10, the mighty angel. But here is our towering angel.
Those are the worst looking legs I've ever seen on an angel.
Yeah, well, remember they're supposed to be kind of have a fiery sense about them, and then of course the glowing face, the rainbow. Supposed to be so tall that he could have 1 foot on the land, 1 foot on the sea.
I just can't imagine Madonna being there.
Okay.
But
you couldn't help yourself.
I couldn't help myself. But the legs are even worse.
Well,
all I'm saying is when I think of an angel, I don't picture something that has that appearance.
This one, this was a hard one to find because it was many different things. And again, these are just artist renderings.
Yeah.
So
it makes you have that visual image.
Yeah, but I was in my study. Part of Eastern tradition, especially in Jewish thought, which comes out of some of the books that a part of our tradition does not read. Maccabees, Enoch,
Judith.
So we've got some of these books that some of this stuff comes out of those. Of course, we have Ezekiel, which some of and Daniel. Some of these pictures are like the measuring of the temple that we're going to talk about later. But some of these things are just re-churned out. And one commentator that I read talked about the fact that a tall angel implied that that's God's servant. If he is that towering and that big and that powerful, imagine how powerful is his God. Helping to, again, reinforce this idea of just the power and might that is at God's disposal.
Well, we talked about last week the idea that there were angels that were named, but those were 3 masculine names. There may be, I'm drawing a blank here just for a minute, but maybe there were women angels.
There was one.
There was one?
That I'm aware of.
Oh, okay.
Let me rephrase that. In one of the translations, it is spoken of as a messenger in the female tense.
Oh.
So, but I don't remember which story that is. But yeah. So, another thing for us to look up and find out.
Another thing to cross off your paper.
Right.
go to something that's constructive.
Verse 5. Then the angel I had seen standing on the sea and on the land raised his right hand to heaven. And he swore by him who lives forever and ever, who created the heavens and all that is in them, the earth and all that is in it, and the sea and all that is in it, and said, there will be no more delay. But in the days when the seventh angel is about to sound his trumpet, the mystery of God will be accomplished just as he announced to his servants, the prophets. Then the voice that I heard from heaven spoke to me once more, go, take the scroll that lies open in the hand of the angel who's standing on the sea and on the land. I'm going to let you read the next part because you're excited about what's about to happen.
There's something time-wise in the middle part of this chapter.
Oh, okay.
Where he said, I'm going to give you this message, but don't write it down.
Yeah.
So John knew what the message was, but he wasn't supposed to write it down because God was keeping it from other people, that the timing was not right. He didn't want them to. It was okay for John to know. And you have this in Daniel too.
Yes.
Not only in Daniel too, I mean Daniel also, where he says, you can write this down, but don't seal it because there's some things that are going to happen rather quickly.
Yes.
And then there's some other messages where he says, you can seal it because it's going to be a long way off. So the messages that were given to John had those same characteristics. He said you can write it down, but don't let anybody else see it. Now, it doesn't give a reason for that, but...
Well, you know, Paul talks about the person who received a vision but wasn't allowed to share it.
Yep, and that was probably him.
And it very well might have been John here that's talking about this, but I don't know if it was or not, because I kind of got the feeling that during this period of time in history, God was doing a lot of things with visions.
Look at verse 6. And swore by him who lives forever and ever. He was taking an oath that he would do what God asked him to do. These people that say, well, you can't take an oath. Paul took a couple oaths in his letters. He's got John taking an oath.
God once said, I swore by myself.
Yeah. I mean, my word is my word.
My word is my word.
So, and then he says, now, be careful here because in just a minute there's not going to be any more delay. The King James says there's not going to be any more time. But he says there's going to be no more delay. In other words, it's going to happen. And the mystery of God, according to verse 7, is going to be announced to the servants and the prophets.
In NIV it says, announced to his servants, the prophets.
The prophets. Peter says in his second epistle, the message that they received was, it was like the angels were standing, I'm paraphrasing here, the angels were standing on tiptoe trying to look over the fence to see what was going on.
To see what was going on.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a beautiful imagery, and it's used here too, where he says, John, who has this mystery of God, he's already written it down, but he's not allowed to share it with anybody. And then finally, there's no delay. He's going to give them the message. And that brings us to verse 8, where the where the scroll is introduced. And you mentioned Ezekiel a little while ago. Before I read this paragraph, Ezekiel in chapters 1, 2, and 3, Ezekiel has almost exactly the same kind of experience with God, except it's not a book that he eats, it's a scroll that he eats. And it makes the inside of his mouth sweet, like, oh, that's really good.
Well, actually, in the NIV, the word has been translated as scroll in this text. Go take the scroll.
Okay. So
it is identical.
In Ezekiel chapters 1, 2, and 3, he says, I'm going to give you this scroll and I want you to eat of it. He opened up the scroll, he ate the scroll. Now, when he says it was sweet, I think of Reese's Cups.
Of course, they talked about honey.
Yeah. I'd rather have Reese's Cups than honey.
Hey, honey would have been the sweetest thing they would have had, maybe.
I heard this voice from heaven, and it spoke to me, saying, go take the scroll which is open in the hand. Now this is the reference that comes from the Old Testament, from Ezekiel. Who is standing on the sea and the land. There's your angel standing on a bridge wide enough that can stand on both places. take the scroll which is open in the hand of the angel. So I went to the angel and told him to give me the little scroll. And he said to me, take it and eat. It will be bitter in your stomach and sweet as honey in your mouth. So the sweet part, like you said, is honey, or just think of the sweetest candy you ever had.
Yep.
And then he says, but there's also going to be a bitter taste in there too. Okay, what's the most bitter thing you've ever had to eat? Now don't bring up any of your mom or dad's cooking. That wouldn't...
The thing that does me the most damage is onions.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, I love the way they taste when you eat them, but
After a while,
they can create a problem for me.
garlic kind of fits in that category.
Garlic
too.
could be in this. Well, of course, garlic doesn't have much of a sweet taste to me, but onions do.
But
Sweet onions do.
I mean, the sweetness is there, and then that sweetness is gone, and now it's tasting bitter.
Right.
So whatever you want to put in your head as to what you like, it's really sweet, or what you don't like, it's really bitter. That was the characteristic of this scroll that Ezekiel opened, and the same thing in the book that John opened in Revelation 10.
And of course, most commentators agree that this is points to the fact that oftentimes, much like you and I were talking about before we started recording, about David recording various things in Psalms, how he would record, I can't wait till this bad thing happens to these people.
Yeah.
Which in a version of that was a sweet thing to him, but what he doesn't realize is this bad thing that's happening to people that you think deserves it, it's going to hurt you.
That's going to be bitter.
It's not going to be what you think it is. You may think you're getting a sweet taste, but in all essence, when it's done, it's going to sour and sicken you. And of course, there's the other double reference that sometimes that's what sin is like too. Sin is, in the moment, it's good. But
Yeah, you wouldn't call it a temptation if it wasn't good.
yeah, if it tasted like crap from the get-go, you'd never eat
You
it.
need to quit reading the NIV.
But that's the
And this is another indication, as we've talked about before, judgment in the book of Revelation.
Mm-hmm.
The good guys and the bad guys, the people who are righteous versus the people who are unrighteous. And so they may be dealing with this bitter taste and with this sweet taste, but individually they had to do that. John had to do that too when he...
yeah.
That was the message God was giving
That
John.
that was John's message, that he could, and because of his experience of it, he understood it better.
He did.
Because it's sort of like Isaiah's moment. When he written his first 5 chapters of woe to all you people. You're worthless. You guys have made a total mess. And he has his vision, goes to heaven and goes, oh no, woe is me.
Well, in Isaiah, that I know that Jerry and Sandra Alderson watched his program faithfully every week, and the passage you mentioned in Isaiah is Jerry's favorite verse because it says this train filled the temple. So he likes that verse because of the train reference. And so
he's thinking,
and both of us
choo,
want
choo.
to say hello to Jerry and Sandra because they moved away from us and went to Nashville, and we really miss them.
And we do very much miss them. Of course,
That was just a train of thought that went through my mind. Right
related to the train.
Yes.
Okay.
And verse 11, and I was told, this is John again, you must again prophesy about many peoples and nations and tongues and kings. All the way through here, he's bringing everybody together.
Yeah.
It's not just Jews and Gentiles, even though he's going to do that too. But now it's all, he's going to prophesy about peoples, nations, tongues, and I love this last phrase, and kings. The kings are thrown in there in these lists every once in a while. keep looking for what's going to happen to the kings, because when we get to the last chapter, something really surprising is going to happen to those kings.
Yeah, you've talked about that. Again, this puts us in a place where we think we have a good grasp of everything, and then we go to chapter 11, and it's like, okay, what in the world? Verse 1 of chapter 11. I was given a reed like a measuring rod, and was told, go and measure the temple of God and the altar with its worshippers. But exclude the outer court. Do not measure it, because it has been given to the Gentiles. They will trample on the holy city for 42 months. And I will appoint my 2 witnesses, and they will prophesy for 1260 days, clothed in sackcloth. They are the 2 olive trees and the 2 lampstands, and they stand before the Lord of the earth. If anyone tries to harm them, fire comes from their mouth and devours their enemies. This is how anyone who wants to harm them must die. They have the power to shut up the heavens so that it will not rain during the time they are prophesying, and they have the power to turn the waters into blood and to strike the earth with every kind of plague as often as they want. Now I got another picture, and here is and what happens oftentimes when you're making a picture bigger, it is not quite the clarity of the original, but here are the 2 witnesses with fire coming from their mouth, and to devour anyone who speaks or tries to harm them or whatever. This begins to where a lot of this apocalyptic stuff begins. The references now become a modge-podge of what everyone thinks this means.
Well, let me muddy up the water here by asking some questions.
Oh, you're just now starting to?
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, I did a little bit before, but I'm really getting the hang of it.
You're getting a stir?
Yeah. You just couldn't help yourself. In the first part of 11, verses 1 through 3, there are lots of questions and very few answers here. He was given a measuring rod, some kind of measuring rod, like a staff, and God told him to go and measure the temple of God. So he's walking around the temple, walking around the court, and he's supposed to measure that. Now, first thing you got to decide is the temple still there? If this book was written in 85 or 90, as most scholars believe, the temple would have been gone.
Yeah.
If the book was written before that, then you obviously have a debate between those 2 dates, which we're not going to get into right here. If you want to lots of scholars have written books about those 2 ideas. So he tells him to measure that. I'm going to go on the assumption that the temple was there, and that's how he measured it. Mm-hmm. And what did they call this? They call it in verse 2, the holy city. These nations are going to come in and trample the holy city. Now, the way I look at Revelation, and depending on which commentaries you read and which books you want to read, it all depends on what you think this holy city is as to how you interpret the rest of the book. Because some people say this holy city was Jerusalem, and some people who are scholars say this holy city was Rome. Well, it could be both of them, because the Jews are after the Christians in the first century, and the Romans are after the Christians in the first century. And so he calls it the holy city. I wrote down in the margin of my Bible, and I'm not going to read all these obviously, that great city is described in chapter 11, 16, 17, 18, 19, 21, 21, and 22. That holy city is referred to in all those chapters. Now, what a person would have to decide if he wants to really get a grasp on what this book means, what city is that? Is that Jerusalem, or is that Rome, or is that both of them? Well, he says these people who are going to trample the holy city, they're going to do it for 42 months. I think, what's that come out, 3.5 years?
Mm-hmm.
Now again, is that a symbol or is that a literal 3.5 years? That goes back to your interpretation of the book. I will grant my 2 witnesses. Okay, who are they? I will grant my 2 witnesses power to prophesy for 1,360 days. That's 3.5 years. And they will be clothed in
I
sackcloth.
have 1,260 days.
1,260
Okay,
days.
thank you.
Yeah. So right in that paragraph, it only consists of 3 verses. You got all kinds of things going on in your mind. Is what does that mean? And is it literal? Or is it figurative? Or is this a sample of something? Or is just John seeing a vision? Or is everything physically happening while he writes this book?
Mm-hmm.
So I throw out all the questions. You give all the answers.
Well, when it comes to this, who has the answer? Because it's,
No,
I don't,
you don't.
any of us all we would be doing would be speculating. And again, that sometimes is the danger. And I, as I keep saying, I draw myself into, I'm kind of like looking at this as an overview story, not trying to do a comparative analysis between what's being written and what's going on today or then or whatever. Yeah. But you're right. As an overview, I mean, we have a temple that's measurable, and we have something that's going on, and there's a trampling of those in this holy city, and we have other things like the 2 olive trees, the 2 lampstands, and they stand before the Lord of the earth.
In your reading and in your study, maybe commentaries you've read or books that you've read, who are those 2 witnesses? What are the suggestions as to who those 2 witnesses might be?
Well, one of them said Enoch.
Because he didn't have to die.
Right. And I forget who the other one was giving reference. Enoch and I guess Elijah?
Well, I can tell you who it's not. It's not Butch and Sundance.
No, it's not Butch and Sundance.
And it's not Laurel and Hardy. There are lots of things. If you look where you're trying to figure out, is this literal or is this specific or is this something that's just a vision that he had? Most of the commentaries that you read, and that doesn't make it right or wrong, but most of the commentaries you read think these 2 witnesses right there are Moses and Elijah. Moses because he represents the law, because he's the great lawgiver, and Elijah because he represented the prophets. He was one of the great prophets, and a lot of times
similar
in
to
the New
same
Testament,
reference back to with Jesus on the Transfiguration.
yes, that Moses is important, but he's not as important as Jesus. Elijah, who represented the prophets, he's important, highly significant.
Yes.
But he's not the Christ. So this is my beloved son, listen to him. It's okay to read Moses. It's very uplifting to read the prophets, but don't put them above at the top of the list and put
Right.
Jesus underneath them.
Exactly.
You're exactly right. So that may be who those 2 witnesses are. I don't think there's any way you can prove it one way or the other. But it's also called in verse 2 the holy city.
Yes.
So we got to find out who these 2 witnesses are and what this holy city is.
In I'll begin reading in verse 6. They have the power to shut up the heavens so that it will not rain during the time they are prophesying. And they have the power to turn the waters into blood and to strike the earth with every kind of plague as often as they want. Both references to Elijah and Moses. Now, when they had finished their testimony, the beast comes up from the abyss. The beast that comes up from the abyss will attack them and overpower and kill them. Their bodies will lie in the public square of the great city, which is figuratively called Sodom and Egypt, where also the Lord was crucified.
And there's that bottomless pit again.
Yeah,
the beast that comes out to make war against the good guys.
Yeah, and now we've got our witnesses.
They're dead.
They're dead, and they're killed in the not holy city, the great city, because it doesn't say holy here. No, but does it mean, is it just going back like, well, is that is that a different city, or is it the same city?
That's correct. And he throws in verse 8, it's a little allegory here. We're going to go from writing specifically and distinctive. We're going to throw a little parable in here. We're going to throw an allegory in here. That these two witnesses are dead and they lie in the streets of the great city. And I've already referred to that. It's either Jerusalem or Rome. I have my opinion about it. Most people have theirs. Which is called Sodom and Egypt. They didn't like Sodom because Sodom was just wrong. Sodom was just sinful and it ended up burning to a crisp. It ended up being destroyed completely.
It's just sort of like Jonah and Nineveh. I mean, he hated Nineveh. Went there because God told him to. Was mad about it the entire trip.
Yep.
So yeah, same thing as Nineveh. And then of course we know how much they loved Egypt.
I have thrown this out before, and let me throw it out again and see if anybody... I don't do this to make anybody look bad. I do this because maybe we will get smarter in this process. There's not one time in the Bible when Egypt is used where Egypt is the good guys.
No.
Egypt is always the enemy. Egypt is always the guys wearing the black hats. You can't find one positive word about it.
Once someone owns you for, what was it, 400 years?
400 years.
I think they kind of are way past ever liking you ever again.
Yeah. There's not going to be any peace treaties that are signed.
I mean, look what our country goes through today, and we're talking about we had slavery for how many years?
400.
Yeah.
A whole lot older than our
Well, I'm talking about as a nation.
Oh, as a nation.
As America. Yeah, I mean, it was going on in Europe up and from as long as time went back till somewhere in the 1800s, late 1700s, early 1800s.
It might give us a little hint when the next phrase he says, called Sodom and Egypt, where their Lord was crucified. Now, you don't have to guess at that one.
No.
Because whether it's a symbol or whether it's literal, he's talking about Jerusalem. That's where Jesus was crucified.
Right. But again, is the great city and the holy city the same city? Okay? Mm-hmm. And then we have another, going back a reference here, a diminished reference for 3.5 days. Some from every tribe, people, language, and nation will gaze on their body and refuse them burial. Okay, now we had 3.5 years up there, and they will prophesy, and they will devour their enemies. But now we've got, for 3.5 days, from every people, tribe, language, and nation. That same favorite part out of verse 11 out of chapter 10 being used, and the inhabitants of the earth will gloat over them and will celebrate by sending each other gifts, because these two prophets had tormented those who live on the earth.
And they're going to be raised.
Yeah.
And live again. Maybe some kind of indication that it's a reference to Jesus' resurrection.
We need to get through verse 14 because we're running out of time.
Let me mention one thing about 9 and 10, and that is that if you enjoy things like this where you're trying to figure out numerical puzzles and quizzes, go back and read Daniel, because you will be just tickled to death. There are all kinds of numbers and years and months and other things.
But see, I don't have the complete understanding of Jewish context to get all that.
Oh, like I do?
Well,
I don't think any of us do.
At least one of us went to school for that.
That goes back to the people who read it originally in the first century.
That's right.
Knew what the puzzle was, and they were putting the piece together.
Enough of them knew what the puzzle was that they could help others.
And that's why he not only wrote those letters to the 7 churches. Those letters were probably circulated to other churches.
That's right.
Where they read them too.
Yeah. But verse 11. But after the 3.5 days, the breath of life from God entered them. And they stood on their feet, and terror struck those who saw them. Then they heard a loud voice from heaven, saying to them, "Come up here." And they went up to heaven in a cloud while the enemies looked on. And at the very hour there was a severe earthquake, and a tenth of the city collapsed. 7,000 people were killed in the earthquake, and the survivors were terrified and gave glory to the God of heaven. You can't help but see the parallels in the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ here. The implications that these mean, and the reference of going up in a cloud, we have that from Acts chapter 1. The severe earthquake when Jesus, when the ground rumbled and when Jesus died on the cross, and then we have the curtain that breaks in the center of the temple. I mean, we have similar references attached to a different event, but with similar storylines. Mm-hmm. I mean, it would have been something they knew the story of the death, being raised again, and being lifted up. Like, hey.
And they knew how he was connected specifically to those two witnesses.
I mean, this entire thing here is almost reenacting the scene of Jesus before the city, where he was tormented, mm-hmm. where he was brought in. They made fun of them. They had feasts. They had party. Maybe they gave gifts to one another. I don't know. But in this storyline, we have that idea.
I think one of the great things to look at in this, even though we might not be able to explain every symbol and every ideology, but when you have these two men laying in the street and people are just looking at him, out of fascination, they're just looking at him. They don't. Well, it's kind of a coincidence. Saturday night, I watched my favorite Western of all time. I've only seen it 10 times, probably 10 or 12 times. The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance. And when Liberty Valance gets shot, and I won't ruin the movie by telling you who did it, but when he gets shot, he's laying there out in the street, dead, and there's all these town folks around him. Nobody wants to go touch him, including the doctor, including the sheriff. Nobody wants to go touch him. Just leave.
Not even the mortuary.
The guy that was a drunk mortician. Yes, he didn't want to touch him either. They're just all staring at him because something that has affected their life so much is now over. This guy's dead. He's not going to do that to us anymore. No. And you've got, maybe, if that's who it is, Moses and Elijah laying in the street for 3.5 days, and nobody goes near them, and nobody touches them, and nobody does anything to disturb their body in any way, because they've been told that God's going to raise these two witnesses up. If that's who the two witnesses are, mm-hmm. then maybe somebody else. Before we quit, I want to make one comment about 11:15. I know we're not down there yet, but please do not jump over this. Please do not pass over this verse. And the seventh angel blew his trumpet, and there were loud voices in heaven saying, "The kingdom of the world has become the kingdom of our Lord and of his Christ, and he shall reign forever and ever."
Well,
here is not only the climax of this chapter, here's the climax of this book. The kingdoms of the world, that's everybody.
Well, it's kind of ironic that just before he makes that declaration, he says the second woe is passing and here comes the third. And he begins the third woe with, hey, great news. For anyone, there's no way. The hardest part about the book of Revelation, it's almost like you need a program to figure out who everyone is, what everything means, and it's like you grew up in, I don't know where you grew up. All right, we grew up in America, and we're getting ready to go watch European soccer in France and try to figure out what they're talking about as they're playing the game. We would be totally lost. I mean, there's just no way. And that's sort of like the way I feel as we've begun this section of Revelation.
And behind that image is John thinking about, as he's inspired by God and the Spirit to give these letters. Part of this image is all the kingdoms that we read about, the natives and the tongues and the tribes and
Languages, yeah.
all those different kingdoms. It's almost as if God is saying through John, I've let you do this long enough. You've messed this up. Let my son try it.
Yeah.
And when my son tries it, the kingdoms of the earth are going to become the kingdoms of the Lord, and he shall reign forever and ever. Now, I don't know why you have to put the other ever on there. He shall reign forever. That pretty much covers it right there, but sometimes in the Bible they put forever and ever and ever. And he says, that's the kingdom that you want to be a part of.
Yep.
You may live in a wonderful nation, but that's not where you spend, that's not where you end up.
Absolutely. Well, I apologize for our going on a little bit more than, and we still didn't get all the way through chapter 11, but we will pick up right there next week as we discuss, continue our discussion on chapter 11 and move in hopefully to chapter 12. I'm afraid our pace may slow down some with some of the things we've got ahead of us, but we will do our best to try not to get in the weeds. And I'm letting Steve on notice right now, I do have a weed eater if he goes there. If you have any,
showing? It's not showing, is it?
No, I'm going to get my
Okay.
powered up weed eater. I am so glad you joined us. Do you have anything you want to add before we go quickly?
I just want to add this quickly. We give thanks to thee, Lord God Almighty, who art and who was. Thou hast taken thy great power and begun to reign. The nations raged, but thy wrath came, and the time for the dead to be judged. For rewarding thy servants, the prophets and the saints, and those who fear thy name, both small and great, and for destroying the destroyers of the earth. Then God's temple in heaven was opened, and the ark of his covenant, we'll talk about that next week, was seen within his temple, and there were flashes of lightning, loud noises, pearls of thunder, earthquake, and heavy hail. The best way to end our sessions all time is reading a paragraph that gave these people hope. And there's a paragraph right there that gave them hope.
Well, listen, we look forward to seeing you again next week. Thank you for joining in with us. Goodbye, and see you next time. Thanks.